We're going to start this video off by solving a simple problem. We want to find x if x squared plus 1 is equal to 0. So all we have to do is subtract 1 from both sides, and we'll get x squared is equal to negative 1. And now to find x, all we have to do is take the square root of both sides. But we come into a problem. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So to solve this problem, people came up with the number I, which is often referred to as the imaginary unit. And I is a number that if you square it, you get negative 1. So the answer to our problem is that x is equal to I. Now let's look a bit more into I and its powers. Because if I to the power of 2 is negative 1, there might be all sorts of crazy numbers we get for other powers of I. So let's start off with I to the power of 0. I to the power of 0. Well, anything to the power of 0 is just 1, so that's equal to 1. What about I to the power of 1? Well, anything to the power of 1 is just itself, so we get I. I to the power of 2 we already know, because by definition, I to the power of 2 is equal to negative 1. So this is equal to negative 1. Now what about I to the power of 3? Well, that is just equal to I to the power of 2 times I. And I to the power of 2 is negative 1. So you have negative 1 times I, which is just equal to negative I. Now let's move on to the I to the power of 4. I to the power of 4 is equal to I to the power of 2 times I to the power of 2. And I to the power of 2 is negative 1. So we have negative 1 times negative 1, which is just equal to 1. So I to the power of 4 is the same thing as I to the power of 0. Now I to the power of 5 would be equal to I to the power of 4 times I. And I to the power of 4 is equal to 1. So we have 1 times I, which is just going to be I. So we see that I to the power of 5 is the same thing as I to the power of 1. Now what about I to the power of 6? Well, that is just I to the power of 4 times I to the power of 2. I to the power of 4 is 1, and I to the power of 2 is negative 1. So you have 1 times negative 1, which is just negative 1. Now what about I to the power of 7? I to the power of 7 is just I to the power of 4 times I to the power of 3. And I to the power of 4 is 1, and I to the power of 3 is negative I. So we get negative I. And this pattern will keep going and going. I to the power of 8 will be equal to 1, I to the power of 9 will be equal to I, and so on and so forth.